The arrow was still trembling in the wood of the door when Penny finally lowered her arm. She did not remember picking up the bow. She did not remember crossing the great hall of the Hartwell estate, stepping over the shattered clay jug her stepmother had thrown against the wall an hour before, or lifting the old hunting weapon down from the hooks above the servants' corridor. What she remembered was the sound, her younger brother Eli's voice breaking through the floor above her, thin and high with fever and fear, and then the heavy boots of Lord Cedric's men crossing the threshold without invitation, without warning, without right. The arrow had buried itself 2 inches from the lead guard's ear, close enough that he could feel the wind of its passing on his cheek, and now it hummed in the old oak like a plucked string. No one in the hall moved. Penny stood with her golden braid over one shoulder, her gray wool cloak still dusted with flour from the morning's bread-making, her linen dress wrinkled from the long night she had spent at her brother's bedside. She was 23 years old, an Omega without a pack, without a wolf strong enough to matter, and she had just put a warning shot into the front door of her own home, in front of 5 armed men who wore the crest of a beta lord that outranked her in every way the kingdom recognized. Her hands were not shaking. She found that strange. She had expected them to shake. "Lady Penelope," the lead guard said slowly. His voice was careful now. The arrogance had drained out of it like water from a cracked vessel. He was a big man with a soldier's neck and a scar through one eyebrow, and he was looking at the arrow, not at her, which told her everything she needed to know about who was truly in control of the room. "Lord Cedric requests your presence at Thornvale Manor. The matter concerns your brother's debt." "Eli has no debt," she said. Her voice was quiet. That was another thing she found strange. How quiet she sounded, how steady, when inside her chest something had been screaming since dawn. "Whatever papers you are carrying were not signed by him. They carry his seal. Eli is 16 and has been bedridden with fever for 11 days. He has not left that room. He has not touched a seal." She set the bow down against the wall with a deliberate calm, because she understood that the bow had already done what it needed to do. It had bought her this single moment of stillness, this handful of heartbeats, in which 5 men who could break her in half were choosing, one by one, not to move. So whoever signed those papers did so without his knowledge, and without his consent. Which means what you are carrying is a forgery. The guard's jaw tightened. She watched the muscle in it work, watched him weigh the arrow in the door against the report he would have to give if he crossed a woman who could put one there, and she understood that a beta lord's men had been sent to frighten a servant, not to fight a marksman, and that the 2 were not the same errand. Behind him, the other 4 men exchanged glances she was not meant to see, but she did see them. One of them, the youngest, had let his hand drift off his sword hilt entirely, and was looking at the fletching in the oak the way a man looks at a thing he means to tell his children about. She had spent her whole life learning to see things she was not meant to. That was the curse of being what she was. Not quite a full Omega. Not quite anything the pack structure had a clean name for. Her inner wolf was present but silent, like an ember that refused to go out but also refused to catch. The healers had called it a dormancy condition when she was a child. Her stepmother, Lady Voss, had called it a defect. The pack elders had called it irrelevant, and assigned her to household duties and low-rank obligations before her father's body was cold in the ground. But her father had taught her to shoot before he died, and he had taught her to read, and he had told her, in the last winter of his life, when the sickness was already deep in his lungs, and the firelight was low and gold between them, "Penny, the world will try to tell you that quiet means weak. Let them think so. Let them keep thinking so." She had let them. Until today. "You will leave my brother's name out of whatever arrangement Lord Cedric has constructed," she said, "and you will leave this house. When I have consulted a lawkeeper of the crown, I will answer any legitimate claim through the proper channels of the kingdom, not through men with weapons appearing at my door before the morning bells." There was a long pause, then the lead guard reached into his vest and withdrew a rolled parchment sealed in dark wax. He set it on the table beside the door, not handed to her, set down, like an offering or a threat that had not yet decided which it was, and turned without another word. The 4 men followed him out. The door closed behind them, and the arrow shivered once with the draft and went still. Penny stood there for a moment, in the sudden silence of the hall, listening to the crunch of hooves on the frozen ground outside, growing fainter, and then she let herself breathe. Just one breath, long and slow, released through her nose because she could not afford to let it become a sob. There was no one to collapse in front of. There was only Eli upstairs, and the cold hearth, and the smell of old smoke and damp stone, and the dark wax seal on the parchment she had not yet touched. She crossed to the table. She broke the seal. She read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly, and felt the floor shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the physical world. The document bore Eli's seal, as the guard had said. It also bore the countersignature of Lady Voss, her stepmother, in her capacity as his acting guardian. The claim was simple and total. In exchange for a sum of coin already received and already spent, the Hartwell estate, which had belonged to Penny's father and was meant by his written will to pass to his children upon Eli's majority, had been signed over in full to Lord Cedric of the Thornvale Lowlands. The transfer was dated 3 weeks ago, while Eli lay sick. While Penny had slept in the chair beside his bed, changing cold cloths on his forehead, grinding willow bark and chamomile for the fever, sending the last of the household coin to the village healer for a tincture that had barely worked. While all of that was happening, Lady Voss had sold the ground beneath their feet, and had done it in the boy's own name. Penny set the parchment down. She pressed both hands flat against the table, and stared at the cold stone wall and said nothing, because there were no words for this, only a hollow opening in her chest, where something had just been removed without her permission. She had known her stepmother was selfish. She had known there was cruelty in that woman's careful smiles, but she had not known, had not let herself know, that the cruelty ran this deep, that it could reach into a sleeping boy's room and steal his future, while he shivered with fever, and did not know what was being done in his name. She folded the parchment. She tucked it inside her cloak, flat against her ribs where she could feel the edge of it with every breath. Then she went upstairs. Eli was awake when she entered. He was pale and hollow-eyed, his dark hair damp against the pillow, but the fever had broken 2 days ago, and he was stronger than he had been. He looked at her face and knew immediately that something was wrong. He had always been able to read her, this boy, ever since he was small enough to follow her through the estate gardens asking questions she did not have answers to. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing you need to worry about tonight," she told him. She sat on the edge of his bed and straightened his blanket and did not let her hands tremble. "But I need to leave for a few days. I need you to stay here, keep the door barred, and speak to no one from Thornvale Manor. Can you do that?" He studied her for a long moment. He had their father's eyes, dark and slow to be fooled. "Where are you going?" "To find someone who can help." She had said the words before she fully knew what she meant by them, but as they left her mouth they felt true. There had to be someone. There had to be a place outside this cold corner of the kingdom, where a forged document and a stepmother's betrayal could be named for what they were, where an Omega with no pack and no political standing could still be heard. She had heard once, from a traveling lawkeeper who had stopped at the estate 2 summers past, that the Alpha King held open petitions on the first day of each moon cycle, that any citizen of the realm, pack or packless, Alpha or Omega, noble or common, could present a lawful grievance before his court, that this king, unlike the 3 before him, enforced the old codes, that he had rebuilt the crown's law-keeping arm from the ruin his predecessors had made of it, and that forged inheritance documents were exactly the kind of offense his tribunal had been known to overturn. She did not know if any of it was true. Stories traveled strangely through the lowland villages, stretched and altered by the telling, but it was the only direction she had, and a direction was better than a locked door. "Penny!" Eli's voice stopped her at the threshold. When she turned, he had pushed himself up on one thin elbow, and his jaw was set in a way that made him look suddenly older, made him look like the man he was going to become. "The papers, whatever they made me sign, I didn't. I know. They're wrong." He said it fiercely, as if it were the most important thing in the world, which in a way it was. "Tell them the documents are wrong." "I will," she said. "I promise you I will." She packed before dawn, one change of clothes, the parchment against her ribs, her father's signet ring, which she wore on a cord around her neck, and had never once removed, enough dried bread and salted meat to last 3 days on the road, her cloak, her boots, and the small bone-handled knife she kept beneath her mattress, because the world was what it was. And, at the last moment, standing in the cold hall with her hand on the doorframe, she took the bow down again from its hooks, and the half-quiver of arrows beside it, and slung them across her back beneath the cloak, because her father had also taught her that hope was a fine thing to carry so long as you carried something sharper alongside it. She did not wake Lady Voss. She did not leave a note. She walked out of the estate in the grey hour before sunrise, when the frost on the stone path caught what little light there was, and made the world look like the inside of a dream, and she did not look back. Not because she did not love what she was leaving, but because looking back was a luxury she could not yet afford. The road to the king's city was 4 days north. She had no horse, she had no pack escort, she had no status that would move guards out of her way, or innkeepers to give her their best room. But she had her father's ring, and the forged document, and the truth, which was the one thing no one had managed to take from her. And she had, somewhere in the quiet, stubborn center of herself, the last thing her father had ever given her, the absolute refusal to disappear. The road north was longer than 4 days when walked on an empty stomach in the tail end of winter. Penny had not accounted for the mud. The thaw had come early to the land roads, turning the packed earth into something that sucked at her boots with every step and made each mile feel like 2. By the second morning the soles of her feet burned with the particular cruelty of cold that pretends to be numbness before it becomes pain. She stopped at a stream to drink, crouching at the bank with her cloak pulled tight and her braid falling over her shoulder into the gray water, and she thought of Eli barring the door of the estate behind her, eating whatever was left in the cold pantry, listening for hooves. The thought was enough to get her standing again. She had learned that trick young, how to borrow strength from someone who needed you when you had none left of your own. The first night she did not risk a village. She made a cold camp in the lee of a fallen oak a stone's throw off the road, ate a strip of salted meat and half a heel of bread, and lay with her back to the trunk and the bow across her knees, and her father's ring closed in her fist, and did not sleep so much as rest in shifts, the way an animal rests, surfacing at every shift of the wind. Twice she heard riders on the road and lay still until they passed, and both times she thought, "They are not for you," and both times she was not certain, and that not being certain was its own kind of company on a black road in winter. She thought about Lady Voss, who at this hour would be sleeping in a warm bed in a house she had already sold, and felt the anger try to warm her, and let it, because a body will burn whatever fuel it has, and anger burns hotter than fear. Toward the gray middle of the second day, she came on an old woman driving a mule cart stuck to the axle in a slough of thawing mud, and Penny might have walked past, another traveler had, she watched him go, but she did not walk past, because her father had never once walked past anyone stuck in anything, and grief has a way of making you do the things the dead would have done. She put her shoulder to the wheel and her boots to the mud, and heaved while the old woman clicked at the mule, and the cart came free with a sound like the earth reluctantly giving up a secret, and Penny was filthy to the knee for her trouble. "You're going the wrong way for sense," the old woman observed, looking her over, the mud and the bow and the careful economy of a person rationing food. "North Road's rogue country now. Whole villages sitting up nights. What's a lone girl want up there worth the walk?" "The king," Penny said. The old woman barked a laugh, and then saw her face and stopped laughing. She dug in the cart and came up with a wedge of yellow cheese and a wrinkled winter apple, and pressed them into Penny's hands, and would not hear a refusal. "For the wheel," she said. "And because folk who help strangers on the North Road these days are getting scarce, and I don't like a world where they die of it." She clicked at the mule again, and the cart rolled on, and just before it went round the bend she called back without turning, "Whatever you're chasing, girl, chase it all the way. Half a chase gets you killed. The whole of one, now and then, gets you what you came for." Penny ate the apple walking, core and all, and thought that the North Road, for all it was said to be full of thieves, kept handing her things she had not earned. She would find, in time, that this was not luck. It was that people who have almost nothing recognize their own, and give to it, and that she had a face the almost nothing trusted, because it was one of their own faces, and she had simply never had a mirror honest enough to show her so. She reached the village of Ashenford on the 3rd day. It was a small place, a cluster of stone buildings around a central well, a blacksmith's forge that coughed black smoke into the pale sky, and a tavern with a lopsided sign that had once read something and now read nothing decipherable. The smell of the place was iron and wet wool and horse dung, which Penny found almost comforting after 2 days of smelling only frozen pine and her own exhaustion. She went to the tavern because it was the only building with firelight visible through its shutters, and she was past the point of pride about warmth. The interior was low-ceilinged and crowded with the particular kind of crowd that gathered in border villages in the late afternoon. Traders, traveling craftsmen, a few pack soldiers in mismatched gear who were either off-duty or deserting, it was hard to say. Nobody looked at her directly when she entered, which was the best possible outcome for a woman traveling alone with no escort and no pack markings. She found a seat near the hearth and ordered broth with the last coin she had set aside for food. The barmaid who brought it was a broad-shouldered woman with gray-streaked hair, and the flat gaze of someone who had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. She set the bowl down, looked at Penny's cloak, at the dust on her boots, at the careful way she was holding herself upright, and said nothing, which was, in Penny's experience, the highest form of kindness a stranger could offer. She was halfway through the broth when the argument started. It came from a table near the door, 2 men, one large and red-faced, one wiry and pale, and between them a third figure, a boy of perhaps 12 who was trying very hard to take up no space at all. The large man had the boy's collar bunched in his fist. The wiry one was reading aloud from a document in a voice that carried the practiced flatness of someone who collected debts for a living. "Bond of servitude," the wiry man said, "signed by one Garrett Fowle of Ashenford Village, indebted to the Land Merchant Consortium in the sum of 40 silver marks. Upon default," said Bond, "transfers to the eldest male child of the debtor's household." The boy was not crying, he was doing what Penny recognized, the particular stillness of someone who has decided that if they do not move, do not breathe too loudly, do not draw attention to the fear, then perhaps it will not become real. She knew that stillness from the inside. Her broth was getting cold. She looked at it, she looked at the boy, she looked at the document in the wiry man's hands, and thought about the other document folded against her ribs, and felt something tighten in her chest. Not quite anger yet. Something that lived just beneath anger. Something that had been living there since she was 12 years old, and watched her stepmother sit at her father's table and begin the slow work of dismantling everything he had built. "What pack does the Land Merchant Consortium answer to?" she asked. The room went quiet. The wiry man turned to look at her. So did the large one, still holding the boy's collar. The boy turned too, and in his eyes she saw the exact same calculation she had just made in her own head. Is this help, or only a different kind of trouble? "Beg your pardon?" the wiry man said. "The bond document you're reading from requires a pack authority seal to be enforceable in a village that falls within the northern jurisdiction. Ashenford is north of the Greyvale border, has been since the boundary revision 3 king reigns ago." She had read this years ago in one of her father's law ledgers. She had read almost everything in her father's library, because there had been nothing else to do in the long winters after he died, and the library was the one room Lady Voss had not bothered to repurpose. "If you don't have a northern pack seal on that document, it's unenforceable here, and seizing the child before you can prove enforceability is a violation of the Crown's bond codes, revised under the current king in his first year of rule." Another silence, longer this time. "Who are you?" the large man said. "Someone passing through," Penny said. She looked back down at her broth. "Someone who knows how to read." It was a gamble, and she knew it as she said it. She did not actually know that she had the boundary revision exactly right. She was working from memory and a 3-year-old law ledger, and the particular desperation of someone who needed her bluff to hold for approximately 30 more seconds. But she kept her face calm and her posture still, and she looked at the bowl in front of her rather than at the men, which was a trick she had learned long ago. People are less likely to challenge a certainty they cannot make eye contact with. The wiry man rolled the document. He tucked it inside his vest. He said something low to the large man, and the large man released the boy's collar. They left without ordering anything, which meant they had either believed her completely or decided she was not worth the complication. Either way, the door swung shut behind them, and the boy stayed exactly where he was, breathing. Then he crossed the room and stood beside her table. "Is that true?" he said, "what you said about the seal?" Largely, she admitted it, because she liked the look of him, the way he had waited to ask until the men were gone. "The boundary revision is real. I'm less certain about the specific seal requirement." But they didn't know that. The boy stared at her for a moment, then something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, more the specific expression of someone who has just decided to file a person away as trustworthy, which Penny had always thought was worth more than any smile. "Fen," he said, as if paying her back with the only currency he had. "That's my name, Fen. Penny. They'll come back, Penny," he said it plainly, without self-pity, the way children say true things before the world teaches them to soften them. "Men like that always come back. My da can't pay," he tried. "Then your da needs a lawkeeper, not a bigger stick," she said. "And there's one 4 days north of here who might actually listen. I'm going to see him myself." She had not meant to say it aloud. But the boy's face did something at the words, a small stubborn kindling, and she decided she did not regret it. He went back to his table without another word, and the barmaid appeared at Penny's elbow and set down a heel of dark bread and a small wedge of hard cheese without being asked, then turned to go. "I can't pay for that," Penny said. "Didn't ask you to," the barmaid said. She looked at the door the two men had gone out of, and then back at Penny, and for the first time, something moved behind that flat gaze. "You'll be wanting a bed. I've got a cot in the back and a floor that needs sweeping, and a night coming that I don't much like the smell of. You work the room till close, you sleep dry, and you leave in the morning with your belly full. That's my offer." Penny thought about the 2 coppers she did not have, and the 4 days still ahead of her. "What don't you like the smell of?" The barmaid's mouth did something that was not a smile. "Rogue talk. There's a band been working the border villages since the thaw. Wolves that answer to no pack and no king, taking what they like from folk too small to be worth the crown's notice. 2 hamlets east of here burned last week. Ashenford's got no wall and no soldiers worth the word." She set a rag on the table in front of Penny like a verdict. "So, you sweeping or you walking?" Penny picked up the rag. She worked the room until the fire burned down to its red heart. She carried broth and small beer and cleared bowls and learned the shapes of the men who drank there, which ones were harmless and which ones only wanted to seem harmless, and she kept her cloak on over the bow the whole while, because her father had also taught her that a weapon you have to go fetch is a weapon you do not have. It was full dark, and the tavern half empty when the door banged open and one of the off-duty pack soldiers who had gone out for air came back in fast, white to the lips, dragging the cold in with him. "Riders on the East Road," he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it. "No colors, torches, they fired the Mel barn." For a moment no one in the tavern moved. Then everyone moved at once, and it was the wrong kind of movement, the scramble of people who have never trained for this and are only now discovering it. A trader knocked his own bench over. The barmaid was shouting something about the cellar. Fen was on his feet by the hearth with his back to the wall, and that terrible stillness on him again. And through the open door Penny could see it now, the smear of orange along the eastern dark, and closer, much closer than a barn, the shapes of men on horses coming down the single street of Ashenford at a canter, and the flat wolf-yellow shine of eyes that had shifted halfway, and stopped there on purpose, to frighten. The first of them was through the door before the soldier had finished speaking, a big beta with a torch in one fist and a short blade in the other, and he swept the torch in a wide arc so the flame lit up every frightened face in the room. "On the ground," he bellowed, grinning, drunk on the ease of it. "Purses and rings on the tables, nobody's a hero, nobody bleeds." Behind him 2 more crowded the doorway, and outside a 4th was already touching his torch to the thatch of the smithy across the way. The soldier who had brought the warning went for his sword, and the beta hit him across the temple with the flat of the blade almost without looking, and the man went down and stayed down. That was when the fear in the room curdled into panic, and panic, Penny knew, was how small rooms full of people got everyone killed. The beta's eyes found the fallen soldier's sword on the floor, and then swept the room, contemptuous, and landed on the rack of the barmaid's old wall-hung crossbow above the bar, unstrung, useless, and he laughed. "Anyone here know how to shoot?" he shouted, mocking, spreading his arms wide to the room of huddled traders and shaking craftsmen, daring them, certain of the answer. "Anyone? No? No brave souls in Ashenford tonight?" The waitress set down the tray she was holding. Penny stood slowly. She did not stand the way a frightened person stands. She rose the way water rises when a stone is dropped somewhere deep, smooth and certain and without hurry, and she reached back under her cloak, and the bow came off her shoulder into her left hand as if it had grown there, and an arrow came off the string of the quiver into her right, and by the time she was fully upright the arrow was already nocked and the string was already drawn to the corner of her mouth, and the broad iron head of it was pointed at the hollow of the beta's throat from 15 feet away. Everyone froze. The whole room, the raiders and the huddled and the boy by the hearth, went utterly still, the way a field goes still when a hawk's shadow crosses it. The beta's grin did not fall so much as forget itself. He was looking down the shaft of the arrow into the face of a barmaid in a flour-dusted cloak, whose golden braid had come half loose over her shoulder, whose gray eyes had gone quiet and flat, and absolutely without fear, and some old animal part of him understood before the rest of him did, that he had asked the wrong room. "I do," Penny said. "You won't," the beta said, but the certainty had left his voice, and both of them heard it leave. "I put one main, 2 inches from a man's ear 3 days ago, because I wanted him alive to carry a message," she said, and her arm did not so much as quiver, and the draw did not so much as slip. I don't have a message for you, so think carefully about the next thing you do." For the space of 3 heartbeats nobody in Ashenford breathed. Then the raider in the doorway behind the beta shifted his weight, going for the knife at his belt, and Penny's world narrowed to the clean bright arithmetic her father had drilled into her by a frozen pond 20 winters gone. Wind, distance, the small held breath, the loose. She swung and loosed and knocked and drew again before the first arrow landed, and the first arrow took the man in the doorway through the meat of his shoulder and spun him screaming into the doorframe, and the second arrow was already aimed back at the beta's throat before he had finished flinching. "The next one goes where I said," she told him. "Out, take your torch and your friend, and get on your horses, and burn some other village that isn't under my roof tonight." She had not decided when it had become her roof. It had simply happened somewhere between the tray and the string. The beta's tongue came out and wet his lips. He was a big man, and he had come into a small room certain of what big men are always certain of, and she watched that certainty die by degrees, the way a fire dies when you close the flue, no drama to it, only the light going out of him. "You're one woman," he said. But he said it the way a man says a thing he has stopped believing, testing it to see if the words alone might make it true again. "I am," Penny agreed. The bowstring bit into the corner of her mouth. Her arm had begun the fine, deep tremor of a draw held too long, and she knew it, and did not let it into her voice, because a voice that shakes invites the second man to be brave. "And you're bleeding on the floorboards, and your friend can't lift his arm, and the thing about a bow is I only have to be right once. You have to be right every single time for the rest of a very short night. Those aren't good odds for a man who came here for someone's grandmother's rings." The beta looked at his friend clutching a fletched shaft in his shoulder. He looked at the door. He looked one more time into the face of the woman who had put it there, and whatever he saw finished the argument, because he lowered the torch, and he backed toward the door, dragging his wounded man, and then they were gone into the dark, and the sound of hooves was moving away rather than closer, east, back the way they had come, toward the burning barn that had been enough for them after all. Penny held the draw until the hoofbeats faded to nothing. Then she let the string down slow, because a bow released dry can crack, and her father had taught her that too, and she stood there in the middle of the wrecked and silent tavern, with a room full of people staring at her, as if she had walked in from a story rather than off the road. The barmaid came out from behind the bar. She looked at the 2 arrows, one in the doorframe and one still knocked, and she looked at Penny, and she said, in a voice gone rough, "There's no floor needs sweeping tonight. You sleep in the good bed." Fen was the first to move after that. He crossed the room and stood in front of her and looked up into her face with his whole soul in his eyes. "You said you were passing through," he said, accusing and delighted at once. "I am," Penny said. She was suddenly, enormously tired, the way you only get after the fear has somewhere to go. "First thing tomorrow." But she did not leave first thing. She stayed the morning, because a man had to have the arrowhead cut out of the raider's friend's shoulder, which she'd hit, and she was the only one who knew clean from foul when it came to a wound, and because the whole of Ashenford came to the tavern in ones and twos to look at the waitress who had turned into something else, and to press small things into her hands, a strip of dried meat, a mended sock, a copper worn smooth by 3 generations of thumbs. She took the food and refused the copper and gave it to Fen instead, folding his fingers around it. "For your da," she said. "When the lawkeeper comes, there's paper wants paying for." The barmaid walked her to the edge of the village in the cold, clean light. "Word travels the north road faster than you do, girl," she said. "There'll be a story of you in the city before your boots are dry. A waitress who dropped 2 rogues with a hunting bow." She squinted at the road ahead as if she could see it running. "Might be that helps you. Might be it doesn't. Kings are funny about people who don't need saving." "I'm not going to the city to be saved," Penny said. "No," the barmaid agreed, and there was something almost like approval in the flat gray gaze at last. "No, I don't expect you are." Penny left Ashenford with a full belly and a heavier quiver, 3 of her own arrows recovered and 4 more the smith had beaten out overnight from the raider's own dropped blades, and she reached the king's city of Velmont by the following evening, just as the last light was leaving the sky and the great stone walls were going from gold to gray in the failing sun. Velmont was nothing like the lowland villages. It was a city built on a ridge, its towers rising in tiers above the surrounding plains, like something grown from the rock rather than constructed on it. Torches burned along the outer wall, and even from a distance she could smell wood smoke and iron, and the particular density of many bodies and many fires crowded into a small space. The gates were still open. They closed at the final bell, and she had arrived in the thin window before that, and the guards at the entrance gave her the same indifferent look all guards gave to lone travelers on foot, who were not obviously dangerous and not obviously important. She gave them her name. She showed them her father's signet ring. One of the guards looked at the ring a moment longer than necessary, and then his eyes came up to her face and lingered there in a way the first look had not, and she saw a flicker of something cross it, recognition, or the beginning of it, before he mastered it and waved her through. She thought of the barmaid's warning and did not slow her step. She found a pilgrim's lodging house near the inner gate, a narrow building of gray stone run by an elderly woman who charged 2 coppers a night, which Penny now had, thanks to a smith and a barmaid and a village that had decided she was theirs, and who asked no questions, which Penny valued more than the roof. The room she was given was small and cold, with a straw mattress and a single tallow candle, and a window that looked out onto the blank wall of the building next door. Penny sat on the edge of the mattress, pulled the parchment from inside her cloak, and laid it flat on her knee. She read it again. In the candlelight the forgery was even more obvious to her. The pressure of Eli's seal was wrong, too light, pressed by someone who did not know how her brother bore down when he signed things, with the full weight of his palm behind it. Their father had taught him that. A seal you can barely see, her father used to say, means a lord who barely believes in what he's signing. She folded it carefully and tucked it back against her ribs. Tomorrow was the first day of the new moon cycle. She had arrived, against all reasonable expectation, exactly in time for the open petition. She blew out the candle to save it and lay down on the straw in her cloak and closed her eyes. Her feet ached. Her shoulders ached from 2 days of walking into a headwind and 1 night of holding a draw longer than any bow was meant to be held. The city outside made its sounds, the distant bells, the voices of guards on their rounds, a horse somewhere, the creak of a shutter, and she lay in the dark and thought about her father, who had believed in the old codes, who had trusted the crown's law to mean something, who had died still trusting it. She hoped he had not been wrong about that. She hoped the king was what the story said. She fell asleep still hoping, which was something she had not expected to do. She did not see the figure who paused outside the pilgrim's lodging house that night. She did not see the tall man in a dark riding cloak who had come into Velmont 3 hours after she did, from the eastern road, with a small guard escort he had left at the outer gates, and who had been handed a report by his city captain that mentioned, among other things, a lone Omega woman who had presented a Hartwell signet ring at the gates. She did not see that the report had a second page, and that the second page had come up the north road ahead of her, and that it told of a waitress in a border village who had stood slowly in a room full of rogues and asked to be tested. She did not see him read that second page twice. She did not see him pause on the street below her window and look up at the dark rectangle of glass for a moment, not long, just a moment, before walking on. She was already asleep. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that he already knew hers. The petition hall of Velmont was not what Penny had imagined. She had built it in her mind during 4 days of walking, a grand cold space, high-ceilinged, with the kind of formal silence that made every footstep sound like an accusation. She had imagined rows of nobles in fine wool, clerks with ink-stained fingers recording every word, and at the far end, elevated and distant, a king who looked the way a king was supposed to look, older, formal, separated from the room by the sheer weight of his authority. What she found was more complicated than that. The hall was large, yes, stone arches, long windows that let in the flat gray light of a cloudy morning, tapestries on the walls showing wolf and moon motifs in deep blue and black thread. But it was also full of people who looked like her, common people. A farmer with mud still on his boots presenting a land dispute, a widow with a stack of documents tied in twine arguing over a seized mill, a pack elder from one of the northern villages speaking in the clipped dialect of the high territories, describing a boundary violation that had gone on for 2 seasons. There were nobles present too, seated along the side walls on carved benches, but they were not the center of the room. The center of the room was the long oak table at the far end, where 3 members of the king's tribunal sat reviewing documents, and behind them, elevated by only 2 steps, not a throne, just a chair of dark wood with a high back, was the king. Penny saw him before she understood that she was seeing him. She had entered near the back of the hall and was working her way toward the petition clerk's table when her eyes moved, as eyes tend to do, toward the point of highest stillness in a busy room. He was the stillest thing in the space, not rigid though. Stillness was different from rigidity. she knew that now, had learned the difference between the stillness of fear and the stillness of someone who had simply never needed to move unnecessarily. He was leaning forward slightly, one forearm resting on the arm of the chair, listening to the pack elder's argument, with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely processing what he heard, rather than waiting for it to finish. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, perhaps a few years beyond it. Dark hair pulled back in tight braids that fell past his shoulders, black as scorched wood. A scar at his jaw, thin and old. Eyes that, even from across the hall, struck her as unusually light, gray-blue, the color of the sky just after a storm has passed, and before the true blue returns. He wore dark leather and a mailed vest beneath a short fur-lined cloak fastened at the shoulder, which was less formal than she had expected from a king receiving petitions, but which she noticed the guards in the room mirrored in their own posture, straight-backed, alert, taking their cue from him without being told. This, she thought, was what actual authority looked like. Not performance, not costume, just the specific gravity of someone who had been carrying real weight long enough that it had shaped how they stood. She reached the petition clerk's table and gave her name. The clerk, a small man with spectacles of shaped horn and the distracted expression of someone managing 17 things at once, wrote it in his ledger and gave her a numbered token without looking up. She was 43rd in the queue. She found a place along the side wall, stood, and waited. She spent the waiting time watching the king work. He was not performative in his judgments. When the widow finished her argument about the mill, he asked 2 questions, specific and practical, about the original deed terms and the date of seizure, and then conferred briefly with the tribunal member on his left, before delivering a ruling that was clearly not what the opposing lord had expected. The lord, a heavy-set man in expensive wool, began to protest. The king looked at him, just looked at him, without raising his voice or changing his expression, and the protest died before it fully formed. Penny filed that away somewhere useful. The queue moved slowly. By the time her number was called, the flat morning light had shifted to the warmer angle of late morning, and her feet had resumed the low-level ache she was beginning to think of as her permanent condition. She walked to the center of the hall, stopped at the indicated mark on the stone floor, and looked up at the tribunal table. The king's eyes moved to her. Up close they were exactly the color she had thought, gray-blue and steady, taking her in without the particular sweep of assessment she was used to from men in positions of power, the look that measured and categorized and dismissed. His gaze landed on her face and stayed there, which she found unexpectedly disconcerting, because she had prepared herself for dismissal and did not have a good response ready for being actually seen. Petitioner Penelope Hartwell, the clerk announced. Grievance filed under inheritance and documentation fraud. Speak, said the king. His voice was low and even, carrying across the hall without effort. Penny had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it in the lodging house before dawn, had gone through it twice in her head while standing in the queue, had arranged the points in order of legal weight, the way her father's law ledgers had taught her to construct an argument. She unfolded the parchment with steady hands and began. She laid it out plainly. Her father's death 3 years prior, the will, which left the Hartwell estate to his children, held in trust under Lady Voss's administration until Eli reached his majority, Eli's illness, the guards arriving with the forged document, the seal pressure being wrong, inconsistent with how her brother signed. She described this specifically, knowing it sounded like a small detail, trusting that the tribunal would understand why small details mattered in cases of forgery, the date on the transfer falling within the 11 days Eli had been bedridden and incapacitated. Lady Voss's countersignature as acting guardian, which Penny argued exceeded her administrative authority under the terms of the trust, because the trust allowed her to manage the estate's operations, but explicitly did not grant her the power to transfer title. She had found that clause in her memory at 3 a.m, surfacing out of the same law ledger she had read 6 years ago by firelight, because there was nothing else to do. She set the parchment on the clerk's table. She stepped back to the mark. Silence. One of the tribunal members leaned forward and picked up the document. He examined it for a long moment, turning it in the light. He said something quiet to the king. The king looked at the parchment from where he sat, did not reach for it, and then looked back at Penny. "How did you travel here?" he asked. She had not expected that question. "On foot, my lord." "From the lowlands." "Yes, 4 days. 4.5, she said, because she was not going to understate it to seem less inconvenient. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not quite a reaction, more the absence of the neutrality that had been there before, a very brief gap in the stillness. Then it closed again. "And the road agreed with you?" he said, and there was something under the question now, something she could not read, a current beneath flat water. "The road was mud," she said. "Ashenford was the only warm thing on it." She did not know why she said the name of the village. She saw it land, saw the tribunal member on his left go very slightly still, and understood with a cold dropping certainty that they already knew, that the barmaid had been right, that the story had come up the road ahead of her, and that this king had read it before she ever reached his hall. "The seal discrepancy is visible," the tribunal member said to the room in general, before the king could speak again. "The pressure is inconsistent. This will require verification against the boy's known documents, but the argument has preliminary merit." "Lord Cedric of Thornvale is currently in the city," said the second tribunal member, in the flat tone of someone delivering information without commentary. "He arrived yesterday." Penny felt her stomach drop. She kept her face level. "Then he can be summoned," the king said. He looked at Penny again. "You'll remain in the city until the verification is complete. The crown will provide lodging." "That's not necessary, my lord." "It isn't an offer," he said. Not unkindly, but clearly. She closed her mouth. "Lord Cedric will also explain," the king continued, "how he came to be in Velmont the morning after a petition was filed that directly concerns him. He said it to the tribunal, not to her, but she heard the weight in it, the particular weight of a man who has noticed something and is not yet going to say what he intends to do about it." She was escorted by a guard to a suite of rooms in the castle's eastern wing, small but clean, with a proper hearth and a bed with actual linen, and a window overlooking a stone courtyard where 2 stable boys were raking frost-pale straw. The guard told her a meal would be brought, and that she should not leave without escort until the tribunal had sent word. He said it politely, which she appreciated, though she also noted that it amounted to the same thing whether said politely or not. She sat on the edge of the bed and untied her boots and set them by the hearth to dry, and tried to think clearly. Lord Cedric was in the city. He had arrived the day before her petition. That was not coincidence, and she knew it was not coincidence, and the king had known it was not coincidence. That meant someone had sent word ahead, which meant Lady Voss had known Penny was coming, which meant her departure from the estate had not been as undetected as she had believed. She thought about Eli, alone in the estate with barred doors, and she stood up, and she crossed to the window and pressed one hand flat against the cold stone beside it and breathed, slow and even, through the spike of fear that was trying to become panic. She had the document. She had arrived. She had been heard. Whatever Lady Voss had planned for this moment, she had not planned for the tribunal member to look at the seal and see the inconsistency in 30 seconds. She had not planned for the king to notice that Cedric's presence in the city was suspicious rather than coincidental. She had not planned, Penny thought, with a steadiness that surprised her, for Penny to be as difficult to dismiss as she had turned out to be. The meal arrived: dark bread, a bowl of thick stew with root vegetables, a small clay cup of warm cider that smelled of cloves and apple. Penny sat at the little table by the hearth and ate every bit of it, because she had learned in the last 5 days that keeping herself fed was not a comfort but a strategy. She needed to be sharp tomorrow. She did not know yet that she would not have to wait until tomorrow. The knock at her door came an hour after the meal, when the fire had settled into its lower, warmer register, and the courtyard outside had gone quiet. The guard who opened the door was not the one who had escorted her in. This one wore the king's personal crest on his vest, the wolf and moon insignia she had seen on the tapestries in the petition hall. "The king requests your presence," the guard said. "In the Eastern Library now." Penny looked at him for a moment, then she put her boots back on. The Eastern Library smelled of pine resin and old parchment, and the particular dry warmth of a room that had held a fire for many consecutive hours. Penny followed the guard through 2 corridors and up a narrow staircase before the door appeared. Tall dark oak with iron fittings polished recently enough to still hold a shine. The guard knocked once, opened it without waiting for a response, and stepped aside. She went in. The room was long, lined on 3 sides with shelves that reached the ceiling, reached by 2 rolling ladders of dark wood. A work table ran down the center, covered in maps and open ledgers, and the organized disorder of someone who used the space for actual thinking, rather than display. 3 candelabra burned at intervals along the table. At the far end, standing with his back to her and both hands braced on the edge of the table, studying a map weighted at its corners with small iron discs, was the king. He did not turn when she entered. "Close the door," he said. She did. The guard remained outside. Penny stood near the entrance and waited. Which she had found, across a lifetime of dealing with people who held power over her, was almost always the correct opening move. Let them speak first. Let them show you the shape the conversation was going to take before you committed to a direction. The king straightened and turned. In the candlelight he looked different from the petition hall, not less authoritative but more present, the formal distance of the judicial setting replaced by something more direct. He had removed the fur-lined cloak. The leather vest and the crossed straps over his chest were plain and functional in the way of someone who wore armor because he actually used it, not as decoration. The scar at his jaw caught the light. He looked at her for a moment. Then he gestured to the chair across from where he stood. "Sit," he said, and then, in the same breath, with the faint quality of someone who has just remembered something, "if you want to." She sat, because her feet were grateful, and because she found the amendment interesting. He remained standing, which she also found interesting. He could have sat across from her and used the table as a formal barrier between them. Instead he moved to the side of the table and leaned against it, which put them at a more similar level, and removed the geometry of superiority from the conversation. She did not know if he had done it deliberately. She suspected he did everything deliberately. "I'm told you're a difficult woman to name," he said. "My clerk had you as an Omega, my city captain had you as a Hartwell heir, and a rider up from the border villages had you as a barmaid who put an arrow through a rogue's shoulder in a burning street, and made 2 of them leave a town they'd already decided to sack." He tilted his head, and the light moved on his face. "I've been trying to work out which of those is the true one." "They're all true," Penny said. "I'm beginning to see that." Something in his mouth almost moved. "My name is Xander. There's no need to lord me in this room. The hall is for the hall." "Penny," she said, because he had given her his given name and she found she wanted to answer in kind. "Only my stepmother calls me Penelope, and she does it to remind me she owns the house." "She doesn't," Xander said. "Not anymore. That's part of why you're here." He pushed off the table and moved to one of the open ledgers and turned it so she could see it from where she sat, though he did not yet let her read it. "Lord Cedric came to my court 3 days ago. Before your petition, he came to report that the Hartwell estate had been legally transferred to his holdings, and to request crown confirmation of the title change. He brought documentation." "Forged documentation," Penny said. "Yes." He said it simply, without hedging. "My tribunal identified the seal irregularities before you arrived. We were already conducting a verification when you walked into the hall this morning." He looked at her. "You didn't know that?" "No. You came anyway." "I had the original will and the forged transfer. I had a legal argument," she said. "I didn't need to know what your tribunal was already doing in order for the argument to be valid." Something in his expression shifted, not the brief gap she had seen in the petition hall. Something more deliberate. He was looking at her the way she had watched him look at the pack elder's argument that morning, with the focused attention of someone actually processing rather than waiting. "Lady Voss sent a messenger to Cedric the night you left the estate," he said. "We intercepted the message at the Greyvale crossing. It confirmed what we had begun to suspect, that Cedric and Voss have been in arrangement for over a year, and that the estate transfer was the final step in a sequence." He moved the ledger the last inch toward her. "Cedric has been acquiring land through arrangements like this one, with the administrators of minor estates, 7 of them in the last 2 years. In 4 of those cases, the original heirs were minors, or individuals with limited legal standing." Penny looked at the ledger. The names meant little to her individually, but the pattern was immediately, sickeningly clear. The same structure repeated across 7 entries, the same type of documentation, the same consortium seal in the margin. "He's been doing this systematically," she said. "Yes." "And Lady Voss knew she was part of a pattern." "Almost certainly. The arrangement was too structured to be coincidental. She received payment in 2 installments." He paused, and she felt the pause the way you feel a step that isn't where you expected the floor to be. "The second was delivered 4 days after Eli's fever began." He said it without inflection, but she heard what was in the space around the words, and felt something cold move through her. "We don't believe the fever was natural," Xander said. The room was very quiet. Penny looked at the ledger without seeing it. She thought about the way the fever had come on, fast and hard, faster than ordinary illness, the particular gray quality of Eli's skin in the first 3 days that even the village healer had called unusual. She thought about the kitchen, About the tea Lady Voss had been so insistent Eli drink in the evenings. She thought about the way she had thanked her stepmother for the care, genuinely thanked her, because she had believed. She stopped the thought before it completed itself. Is he safe now? Her voice came out level. She was distantly proud of that. I sent riders to the Hartwell estate this morning, after your petition, Xander said. They reached it by fast horse this afternoon. Your brother is safe. Lady Voss was detained when they arrived. She is being transported to Velmont now. Penny set both hands flat on her knees, under the table where he could not see them, and pressed down until she could feel the pressure in her palms, which was a technique she had developed years ago for keeping the appearance of composure while the internal landscape did something else entirely. You sent riders before you knew how the verification would conclude, she said. The pattern in those 7 cases was enough. Your brother's safety did not need to wait for legal completion. He said it as though it were obvious, as though there had never been a version of the day in which he weighed his own position first. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that same steady attention, and she found she had nothing to say to it, not because she was speechless, but because any response she could form felt insufficient, a small vessel for something that did not fit into words easily. Someone had looked at the evidence and moved immediately to protect Eli, without waiting for the process that would have protected his own position first. She had not known that was possible. She had not let herself know it was possible. Why are you telling me this tonight? She asked. The tribunal will deliver its findings tomorrow. This could have waited. Because you walked 4 days on foot to get here, he said. And because you deserve to know your brother is safe before you spend another night not knowing. Simple, direct, no performance in it. She looked at the fire at the end of the room for a moment. It was burning well, red gold and steady, and the light it cast made the spines of the books on the shelves glow like something alive. She thought about how her father had sat in his own library on cold evenings with exactly this quality of firelight, and read to her and Eli from the old law texts, making it sound like storytelling rather than education, and how she had not understood until much later that it had been both at once. The petition tomorrow, she said, pulling herself back. What happens to the estate? The transfer will be nullified, the will stands. When your brother reaches his majority, the estate returns to full Hartwell control. Until then a crown-appointed administrator will manage the holdings. Not Lady Voss, and not anyone connected to Cedric. He paused. You will have a say in who is appointed, and Cedric will face tribunal for the full pattern of acquisitions, all 7 cases. This is not a private matter anymore. It's a crown matter. His holdings will be frozen pending review. Lady Voss will be charged as a co-conspirator, and the evidence regarding your brother's illness will be examined by the crown's healers. His voice did not change, but she heard the weight behind it, the particular weight of a man who found what had been done to Eli deeply offensive, and intended to say so through the mechanisms available to him. She will not be returning to your estate, he finished. Penny nodded slowly. She was aware of something happening in her chest, not quite release, because the fear and the anger and the grief of the last week did not simply dissolve when justice was confirmed. They shifted. They settled into a different configuration, lower and heavier and more complicated, like stones rearranging themselves in deep water. You said your wolf is dormant, Xander said. It was not quite a question. She looked at him. Word travels fast through a tribunal. Your petition clerk is thorough. A brief pause. Is it painful? Nobody had ever asked her that. Not once in 23 years had anyone asked whether the dormancy was painful, rather than simply noting it as a deficiency in her rank and leaving it there. Sometimes, she said honestly, because she was too tired for any other kind of answer. It's like hearing a voice in another room. I know she's there. I just can't quite reach her. She had never said that aloud to anyone. She was not sure why she said it now, except that the room was warm, and the man across from her had sent riders for her brother before the verdict, and some door in her that had been barred for a very long time had come, without her permission, slightly ajar. He was quiet for a moment. My healers believe dormancy conditions in omegas are frequently response-based, he said, not permanent. Response to what? Safety, he said. Sustained safety, over time. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and there was nothing in his expression that was pressure or implication, just the statement offered and left there, taking up exactly as much space as it needed and no more. She did not know what to do with that, so she filed it away in the same place she had filed the moment in the petition hall, when he had looked at her and not looked through her. You should rest, he said, straightening from the table. "The tribunal convenes at mid-morning. You'll be notified." She stood. She moved toward the door and then stopped, her hand not quite touching the iron latch, because there was one more thing that needed saying, and she was not the kind of person who left things unsaid when they mattered. "There's a boy in Ashenford," she said, turning back. "Fen. His father owes a debt to the same land merchant consortium whose seal is in the margin of every one of those 7 entries. They came to take him as bond servitude while I was passing through. I stopped it with a lie about a boundary revision, but the lie won't hold forever, and the men who tried it will come back, because men like that always come back." She heard the boy's own words in her mouth and let them stay. "If you have jurisdiction over the consortium, that document may have all the same structural problems as Cedric's acquisitions." A beat of silence. She watched him take it in, watched him understand that she had walked into the most consequential room of her life and, at the door of it, spent her last favor on a child in a village she would probably never see again. "I'll have my captain send riders in the morning," Xander said. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more than they usually did, for all of it. She left before she said anything else, because something in the library's candlelit quiet and the steadiness of his attention was beginning to feel dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with threat. The way warmth feels dangerous when you have been cold too long, and your body does not yet trust that it will last. She went back to her room. She lay down on the linen-covered bed. She thought about Eli, safe with the Crown's riders at the estate door, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she fell asleep without bracing for what came next. In the Eastern Library, Xander remained at the table for a while after she left. He looked at the map, he looked at the fire. He thought about a woman who had walked 4.5 days on foot, alone, with a forged document against her ribs and her dead father's ring around her neck, who had stood slowly in a burning village and asked a room full of rogues whether any of them truly wanted to test her, and who had come to the door of his library and, before leaving, spent her breath on a boy she owed nothing. His wolf, which had been restless and strange since the moment her name appeared in the evening's report, settled into a low and certain quiet. He had felt the pull the moment she walked into the petition hall. He had spent the morning telling himself it was something else, the unusual nature of the case, the specific quality of her composure under pressure. He was a king. He had learned discipline in every form it took, but discipline did not change what his wolf knew. He would not tell her yet. She had spent a week running from one betrayal, and she had arrived in his city with her defenses built, out of necessity, into something very close to armor. He understood armor. He had worn his own long enough. He would let her breathe first. He would let her see that safe was not a trick, and then he would tell her. What he did not yet know, standing over his map in the dying candlelight, was that Lord Cedric of Thornvale had already decided he was not going to wait for the tribunal to decide anything at all. Penny woke before dawn out of old habit, and lay in the unfamiliar linen listening to the castle stir, and might have drifted again if she had not heard, under the ordinary sounds, one that did not belong. A footstep in the corridor that stopped when the guard's rounds should have carried it past. A pause, where a pause had no business being. She was out of the bed and into her boots before she had finished deciding to be. Her cloak was over the chair by the hearth, and the bow was rolled inside it, and she had the string half onto the lower knock when the latch of her door lifted, slow, the way a latch lifts when a hand is trying to keep it quiet. The door opened onto a man she had never seen, in plain dark clothes with no crest at all, and behind him a second, and both of them had the soft, careful movements of people who had done this kind of work before, in other rooms, to people who never woke in time. The first one saw the empty bed and took a step toward it, and that was his mistake, because it put his back a quarter turn toward the hearth, and Penny was already at the hearth. "There's nothing in that bed worth your evening," she said quietly, and both men spun, and found her standing with the bow drawn, and an arrow leveled at the space between them, close enough in that small room that she could have chosen either heart at leisure. She had strung the bow by feel in the dark in the time it took them to open a door. Neither of them had expected that. She saw the recalculation move across the nearer one's face, the way it had moved across the beta's face in Ashenford. The discovery that the arithmetic of the room was not the arithmetic they had brought with them. "Whatever Cedric's paying," she said, "it isn't enough to eat an arrow for a man who's going to lose his holdings by noon." The name landed. She had guessed, but the flinch confirmed it. The nearer man's hand drifted toward the knife at his hip, testing, and Penny let the arrowhead follow it, a small, unhurried correction, and the hand stopped. The king's guard walks this corridor every quarter bell, she went on, conversational, keeping her voice low because a shout would only make them desperate, and desperate men were harder to read. You've already used more than a quarter bell being careful, so you have two choices. You can leave the way you came, quietly, and take your chances on the road, or you can find out whether I'm as good as the story that came up the north road ahead of me. She let the corner of her mouth move, just slightly, the way the barmaids had. I'll tell you honestly, the story undersold it. For a long moment the room hung on the edge of a knife. Then, out in the corridor, distant but unmistakable, came the sound of boots, several sets, moving with purpose, and a voice she knew, low and even and carrying without effort, asking a question of someone who answered fast. The two men heard it too. The nearer one made the calculation a heartbeat before his partner, and turned for the door, and they went out of it faster than they had come in, and Penny followed them into the corridor with the bow still drawn, and put an arrow into the doorframe a hand's breadth from the trailing man's shoulder as they fled, not to hit him, but so that the guard rounding the far corner would have a fixed line to chase. Then Xander was there. He came around the corner ahead of his own guards, a blade already in his hand and no cloak and his braids loose as if he had crossed half the castle without stopping to be a king about it, and he took in the whole of it in one sweep, the fleeing men, the arrow buried in the doorframe, and Penny in the doorway in her cloak with the bow still up, and her eyes bright and flat and utterly awake. He gave 3 low words to his guards, and 4 of them were gone down the corridor after Cedric's men. Then he crossed the last of the distance to her, and for the first time since she had met him, the stillness was entirely gone out of him. "Are you hurt?" he said. It was not a question, it was a demand made of the world. No, she let the string down slow, her hands, she noticed with distant interest, had begun to shake now, in the after, the way they had not shaken during. "They came for the woman in the bed. I wasn't in the bed." "Why weren't you in the bed?" "I heard a footstep stop where a footstep shouldn't." She lowered the bow the rest of the way. "You learn to sleep like that in a house, where your stepmother's kindness comes in an evening cup of tea." Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before, in the hall or the library, something that had nothing to do with kingship. He reached out, slow, giving her every chance to step back, and closed his hand briefly over hers where it gripped the bow, and his hand was warm and steady and it stopped the shaking, not by force but by simple contact, the way pressing your palm flat to a table stops it. "He panicked," Xander said, low, and she understood he meant Cedric. He watched a Packless Omega undo a year of his work in 30 seconds in an open hall, and he decided that if the tribunal wouldn't rule his way tomorrow, there would be no one to rule for by morning. His jaw was tight, and the scar on it was white. "He was wrong about you before he ever met you. Everyone in your life has been wrong about you before they met you. I'm beginning to think that's the most dangerous thing about you." "Is it?" Penny said, and found she was almost smiling, in the wreck of the hour, in the cold corridor with an arrow in the doorframe. "It's certainly the most dangerous thing about you for Cedric," he said, and there was the ghost of dry humor in it now, the release that comes after a fright when everyone survives. Then it went out of him, and he was serious again. "You won't sleep in that room again. There's a chamber off the library. It's warm and it locks from the inside and the only corridor to it runs past the war room, which is never empty. You'll take it, and you'll take it as a courtesy from me and not as an offer, because I've learned that's the only way you accept anything." He almost smiled again. "Am I wrong?" "No," she admitted. "Good, then we understand each other." He straightened, and the king came back into his shoulders, but not all the way, not the way it had been. "Come, it's nearly dawn. I don't imagine either of us is sleeping now." They caught the 2 men before the outer gate, and by mid-morning the tribunal had a great deal more to consider than a seal. The tribunal convened under a sky that had finally decided to be clear, and the light came through the hall's long windows in flat, honest sheets that left no shadow in the corners. Penny stood at the petitioner's mark again, but the room felt different from the day before. Lord Cedric was present this time, seated to the left of the hall with 2 of his own attendants, and a lawkeeper in expensive grey wool, who wore the pinched expression of a man who had reviewed the evidence that morning, and did not at all like what he had found. Lady Voss had arrived before dawn under guard escort, and she sat on the opposite bench, her dark traveling clothes still creased from the road, her composure intact in the way of someone who has decided that composure is the only weapon left to her. She looked at Penny when Penny entered the hall. Penny looked back. She did not look away first. She had thought, in the long nights of the past week, that when she finally faced her stepmother across a room where the truth was present, she would feel something sharp and consuming, rage or grief, or the particular devastation of betrayal fully acknowledged. What she felt instead was a quiet, settled clarity, like water after the sediment has finally fallen to the bottom. This woman had tried to erase her brother's future, and had tried, last night, through hired hands, to erase Penny herself. She had failed at both. That was the whole of it. Cedric would not meet her eyes at all. He had the still gray quality of a man who had understood, sometime in the night, that the ground had shifted completely, and that there was no position left to argue from. 2 of his hired men had been taken at the gate with his coins still in their purses, and a king who had personally come around a corner with a blade in his hand did not tend to forget the sight of an assassin fleeing a guest's door. Whatever case Cedric's gray-wool lawkeeper had prepared, it had been for a case about a seal. It was no longer a case about a seal. The tribunal member read the findings in the formal tone of someone who had done this many times and understood that precision was itself a form of justice. The seal verification was confirmed, the pressure, the angle, the depth of impression, all inconsistent with Eli Hartwell's known documentation. The transfer was declared fraudulent. The will of the late Lord Edmund Hartwell was upheld in full. The Hartwell estate, its lands and holdings, was restored to the Hartwell line, with a Crown administrator to manage its operations until Eli's majority, said administrator to be chosen with the approval of Penelope Hartwell as the eldest of the Hartwell heirs. Lord Cedric's holdings were frozen pending full tribunal review of all 7 acquisition cases. He would face formal charges under the Crown's land fraud codes, which carried penalties that the grey-wool lawkeeper was clearly already calculating in his head. And, added the tribunal member without a change in tone, additional charges pending on the matter of the 2 men taken at the eastern gate before dawn, in whose purses had been found coin bearing the Thornvale mint. Cedric said nothing during the reading. There was nothing to say. He had gambled his whole standing on a woman being what everyone had always told her she was, and she had been something else instead. Lady Voss was charged with conspiracy, abuse of administrative authority, and conduct endangering a ward. The Crown's healers had examined the remnants of the evening tea found in the Hartwell kitchen, and confirmed the presence of a suppressing herb, not lethal in the amounts used, but capable of prolonging a fever in a shifter whose wolf was already weakened. The lawkeeper read this finding in the same precise tone as everything else, but the hall went very quiet when it landed. Lady Voss's composure did not break, but something behind her eyes did, some last calculation that had been running since her arrest finally reaching its conclusion. She looked at Penny once more, and Penny held the look steadily, and then the guards moved to escort her from the hall, and she did not look back. It was over in less than an hour. Penny stood at the mark until the hall began to clear, and then she stood there a moment longer, because her legs had decided they needed a brief negotiation before moving. The relief was physical. It moved through her like the first real warmth after a long cold, slow and almost uncomfortable, the way thawing always is. A hand settled briefly at her elbow. She looked up. Xander was beside her. He had descended from the elevated chair and crossed the hall without ceremony, which she noticed had the effect of making the remaining attendants and guards quietly reorganize themselves around his new position, rather than requiring him to announce it. He had the signet ring of his office on his right hand, and in the tribunal's formal light he looked exactly like what he was, the Alpha King of Velmont, the highest authority in the realm, and he was standing beside her at the petitioner's mark as though this were the most natural place in the world for him to be. "Your brother has been informed," he said, quietly enough that it was only for her. "A rider returned an hour ago. He sends his regards, and asked me to tell you his words exactly. He said to tell you that he told you the documents were wrong." Something broke open in her chest, sudden and warm. She laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, the kind that comes before tears if you are not careful. She pressed her lips together and looked at the windows and steadied herself. "That sounds like him," she said. "He also asks when you're coming home." She looked at Xander. He was watching her with that expression she had been trying to name for 2 days, the one that lived between warmth and neutrality, the one that was not performance and not restraint but something more precise than either. She understood it now, looking at it in the clear morning light with the relief of the tribunal still moving through her. He was being careful with her. Not careful the way someone is careful with something fragile, but careful the way someone is careful with something they value, the specific attention of a person who has decided this matters and does not want to move too quickly and damage it. There is something else, Xander said. He did not move closer. He remained at exactly the distance she would have chosen herself. My wolf has known since you walked into this hall yesterday. I've been deciding how to tell you. She was quiet, because she knew what he was approaching, and she was not sure yet what she felt about it. I won't use it as an argument, he said. And I won't ask anything of you on the basis of it. What I'm telling you is simply the truth, because you deserve the truth plainly, without strategy behind it. A pause, measured and deliberate. You are my mate. I believe you may feel some part of that already, even if your wolf hasn't found her voice yet. And I believe that when she does, you'll feel it clearly. He looked at her. But I'm not asking you to accept anything today. I'm asking you to stay in Belmont for a time, if you're willing, to let your brother recover fully before you return to the estate, to let yourself rest, and to let me know you in a way that isn't shaped by a crisis. The hall was nearly empty now. The light moved across the stone floor between them, and somewhere beyond the tall windows a wind had come up and was moving through the city, and Penny could hear it in the gap under the doors, low and steady. She thought about the last 10 years. She thought about what it had cost her to stay upright when everything around her had been designed, in small ways and large ones, to make her believe she was less than she was. She thought about her father's ring, still on its cord against her chest, and the law ledgers, and the bow she had picked up without remembering picking it up, and the broth she had ordered in Ashenford with her last food coin, and the tray she had set down when Abeda had asked a room full of frightened people whether any of them knew how to shoot. She thought about a dormant wolf who sounded like a voice in another room. She thought about what he had said. Safety. Sustained safety. Over time. I'll stay, she said, for now. It was not surrender. They both knew it was not surrender. It was the same thing she had done every day for the past week, in a different register, a decision made in motion with incomplete information, trusting herself to navigate what came next. Something in his expression opened briefly. Then it settled back into steadiness. But it was a different quality of steadiness now, warmer. The way a fire is different after you've added fuel. For now, he said, accepting it exactly as she had offered it. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. There were lords who objected to the tribunal's findings and had to be answered. There were lawkeepers who challenged the procedural basis of the Cedric ruling and had to be addressed through formal rebuttal. There were mornings when Penny woke in the chamber off the library and felt the full weight of the past year land on her before she had finished her first breath, and had to sit with it before she could get up. There were evenings when she sat in the Eastern Library, which Xander had, without formal announcement, begun treating as a shared space rather than his alone, and felt the particular loneliness of someone who is still learning to believe that the good thing in front of them is real. But the library was a good place to learn it. He did not court her the way she had heard alphas courted, with declarations and displays and the pressing weight of a claim. He courted her the way you tame something wild, which is to say he did not try to tame her at all. He simply left the door open. He would be at the work table with a border dispute spread out before him, and she would come in with a law ledger, and they would work in the same quiet for an hour without speaking, and then he would say, without looking up, the Greyvale boundary clause. You cited it in Ashenford. Show me where it actually lives, because my lawkeepers have been looking for it for a week, and half of them think you invented it. I might have, Penny said, the first time, and watched him go still, and then, slowly, laugh. A real one, low and surprised out of him, the way hers had come out of her in the hall. She had not, as it happened, invented it. She found it for him, 3 ledgers deep, in a hand 200 years dead, and she set her finger on the line and did not look up, because she could feel him crossing the room behind her, could feel the exact moment the warmth of him arrived at her shoulder before he had said a word. He read it over her shoulder, standing closer than he needed to, and did not pretend the closeness was about the page. There, she said, her voice came out lower than she intended. The boundary revision. Ratified the winter after the second king's death, buried in a codicil about grazing rights because no one thought a border would ever matter more than a field of sheep. She was very aware of the candle heat, and the leather and wood smoke smell of him, and the quiet of the library pressing in like a held breath. I read it by firelight when I was 15, and had nothing else to do and no one to tell it to. I never once imagined I'd be reading it to a king. You're not reading it to a king, Xander said. His breath moved a loose strand of her hair. You're reading it to a man who has been out-argued by a woman working from a 3-year-old memory, in front of 2 debt collectors, over cooling broth, and who has thought about very little else since. A pause, and she heard him decide something, heard the small honest weight come into his voice. I moved the whole tribunal calendar this week so I'd have my evenings. I've been telling my clerks it was the northern boundary that needed my attention. He was quiet a moment. It was not the northern boundary. Penny did not turn around. If she turned around they would be too close, and she was not ready to be too close, and she wanted, fiercely and for the first time in a very long time, to be too close, and the collision of those two wantings kept her exactly where she was, finger on a 200-year-old line, heart going like a hare's. Finish the clause, she said unsteadily. You skipped the second half. It's the second half that saved the boy. She heard him smile. She did not have to see it. Read it to me again, he said, and stayed exactly where he was. And when he straightened he said, you argued a boundary revision you weren't sure of, to two debt collectors, over a bowl of cooling broth, to save a boy you'd never met. He was not asking. He was turning it over, the way he turned everything over. Most people spend their courage. You seem to make more of it the more you use. My father used to say courage was a muscle, Penny said. He said cowards think it's a coin, that you only get so much and then it's gone. He said that's why they're careful with it. She looked at the old dead hand on the page. He wasn't careful with anything. It killed him a little early and I've never once wished he'd been different. Xander was quiet a moment. I think I would have liked your father. He would have made you read law until your eyes bled and then argued you were wrong about all of it, Penny said. But yes, he would have liked you too. That was the worst thing about him. He liked almost everyone worth liking, and it made his judgment feel like a gift. It was Eli, in the end, who put the bow back in her hand. He had been in the city a week when he mentioned, over supper, and with the particular innocence he deployed only when he was being least innocent, that his sister had once split a hanging apple at 40 paces, to win an argument with a stable hand who claimed a woman couldn't, and that he found it strange no one at the castle had asked to see it. Xander set down his cup and looked at Penny across the table with an expression she had come to recognize, the one that meant he had just decided something and was giving her the chance to decide it first. So the next morning he took her down to the long yard behind the barracks, where the king's own guard trained, and where the guards stopped what they were doing when their king came through the gate and stopped again, differently, when they saw who was with him. There were butts of packed straw at the far end, and a rack of bows, and a cold clean wind off the ridge, and 30 pairs of eyes that had heard the story from the North Road and did not, quite, believe it. You don't have to, Xander said quietly at her shoulder. I told them nothing. If you'd rather they keep guessing, we'll turn around and I'll say you found the wind unfavorable. The wind's fine, Penny said. She was already looking at the rack. The bow she chose was heavier than her father's, a soldier's weapon, and it fought her the first 2 draws the way any unfamiliar thing fights you. Then she stopped fighting it and let it teach her its own weight, which was a thing her father had also taught her, that a bow is not a tool you master but an animal you come to an understanding with, and on the 3rd arrow she found the understanding, and on the 4th she put the shaft dead through the center of the far butt with a sound like a fist striking a door. The yard went quiet. She loosed again, and again, faster now, the old arithmetic running clean and bright behind her eyes, wind and distance and the small held breath, and when the quiver was empty, there was a fist-sized cluster of fletching at the heart of the straw, so tight a man could have covered it with his palm. She lowered the bow and became aware of the silence, 30 soldiers and a captain and a king, none of them moving. Anyone here still guessing? She said mildly, to the yard at large, and there was a beat, and then a grizzled sergeant near the rack barked a single delighted laugh, and the whole yard broke, and someone was already unknocking a wager, and someone else was already refusing to pay it. Xander did not laugh. He was looking at the cluster in the straw, and then at her, and there was something in his face that had gone past admiration into a kind of stillness she had not seen on him before. In Ashenford, he said, low, so it was only for her. You had 1 string, 1 quiver, a room full of people you owed nothing, and no time to think, and you chose to warn instead of kill. You put the first one in a shoulder. It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. A dead man tells no story, she said. A wounded one rides home and tells his friends which village to leave alone. He was quiet a moment. My generals plan campaigns for a season, and don't arrive at that, he said. You arrived at it between a tray and a bowstring. He shook his head slowly. Every single person who ever looked at you and saw a defect was looking at the most dangerous thing they'd ever be lucky enough to have on their side, and not one of them knew it. You knew it. Penny said. Before you met me. From a report on a page. I knew the shape of it, he said. I've spent every day since learning I'd underestimated even the report. He handed her a fresh quiver from the rack, without being asked, the way he did everything. Again? The sergeant's got coin on you now. It would be unkind to disappoint him. She shot again. She shot until her fingers were raw and the light had gone gold, and by the end half the guard had drifted over to watch and to argue technique and to tell her, gruffly and one at a time, that she should come down more often, and Penny understood, walking back up to the castle in the dusk with an ache in her shoulder she was glad of. That she had just been made welcome by the hardest men in the kingdom to make welcome, and that Xander had known that would happen, and had brought her there for exactly that reason, and had let her think it was her idea. There were harder evenings than that one. There was the night she woke from a dream of an evening cup of tea and could not remember for one long cold moment which house she was in, and came out to the library without meaning to, and found him still awake at the table, and did not have to explain, because he simply moved the second chair nearer the fire and said nothing, and let her sit until the shaking stopped. There was the night Lady Voss's sentencing was read, and Penny felt, to her own confusion, not triumph but a grief she had no name for. Grief for the mother-shaped space the woman had spent 10 years failing to fill, and Xander found her on the wall walk in the cold, and stood beside her at the parapet and said, "You're allowed to mourn a thing that was never good. The mourning isn't for what it was, it's for what it should have been." And she had turned and looked at him and thought, with a clarity that frightened her, oh, there you are. There was also the afternoon of the crown healer, which Penny agreed to only because Xander asked it as a question and not a prescription, and because the woman who came to the library to see her turned out to be the same Sarah from the Northern Territories whom Penny would later choose to administer the estate, though neither of them knew it yet. She was old and spare and had hands like a cooper's and a way of looking at a person that skipped past the surface entirely. She did not touch Penny. She sat across from her at the work table and asked her to describe the voice in the other room, and listened, and asked when it had first gone quiet. "I was 6, Penny said, and was surprised to find she remembered the exact winter. My mother died in the spring. My father brought Lady Voss to the house before the next one. It wasn't all at once. She just kept moving things. The furniture first, and then which rooms were mine, and then, slowly, me. By the time I was 8 the healers said dormant, and everyone agreed it was a shame and a defect, and stopped talking about it, and I stopped hearing the voice as anything but a wall." Sarah nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had suspected before she walked in. "A wolf's not a coin either," she said. And Penny went still, because those were nearly her father's words. "Folk think it's given at birth and either strong or weak, and that's the end of the account. But a young wolf's like anything young. It hides when the den's not safe. Yours didn't die, girl. It went to ground. It's been down there 20 years keeping its own counsel and waiting to find out if it was ever going to be safe to come up." She stood, joints cracking, and gathered her satchel of things she had not once opened. "It's coming up. I can smell it the way you smell a thaw before you feel it. Won't be rushed, and shouldn't be. But it's coming." At the door she paused and looked back, and something almost like humor crossed the seamed old face. "You want to help it along. Stop sleeping with one eye open. I hear you strung a war bow in the dark faster than 2 hired knives could work a latch. That's a body that still thinks it's under siege." Her gaze flicked, just once, toward the war room down the corridor and the man in it. "It isn't. Someone ought to tell the rest of you." She left Penny sitting very still in the firelight with her hands flat on the work table, no longer pressing down. Eli arrived in Velmont 3 weeks after the tribunal, riding in a borrowed cart with the crown administrator and a letter he had written in his own hand to the king, formally worded and entirely characteristic of him, careful and precise on the surface and deeply felt underneath. He was thinner than she liked, still carrying the shadow of the fever in the hollows of his face. But he was upright and clear-eyed, and he walked into the courtyard where she was waiting, and hugged her without saying anything for a long time, which was exactly right. When he finally stepped back he held her at arm's length and looked at her, and something in his young face was doing arithmetic. "You look different," he said. "I walked 4 days and shot 2 rogues and told a king he was wrong about the law," Penny said. "It'll do that." "You shot 2 rogues?" "1.5. The other one only needed persuading." Eli's mouth fell open, and then he laughed, delighted, the sound rusty from a month of fever and fear, and it was the best sound Penny had heard in a year. He met Xander that evening at supper. He spent the meal watching the king with the same quiet, categorizing attention that Penny had learned to recognize as his highest form of assessment, asking him questions about the tribunal system that were, she realized halfway through, small tests. Structural questions with wrong answers built into them, and she watched Xander notice this on the third question, and begin, gravely, to answer each one exactly correctly, which was its own kind of courtship, aimed at the brother rather than the sister, and understood by all three of them for what it was. Afterward, walking with Penny through the courtyard, Eli said simply, "He looks at you like you're something he's been looking for without knowing what to call it." Penny said nothing. Eli looked at her sideways. "I'm just noting it." "I know you are," she said. He smiled, which was the first time she had seen him smile in over a month, and the sight of it did something to the last tight knot in her chest that nothing else had quite reached. "For the record," he added, with 16-year-old solemnity, "I approve." He didn't have to send the riders when he did. "I've thought about it a great deal." In the cart, he sent them before he had to. He looked up at the dark towers of Velmont against the first stars. That's the whole of a person, isn't it? What they do before they have to. Penny stopped walking. She looked at her brother, who had been poisoned in his sleep and robbed in his own name, and had come out the other side of it not smaller but somehow larger, still weighing the world by his father's measure. "When did you get wise?" she said, her voice not quite steady. "Same fever that nearly killed me," Eli said cheerfully. "Turns out it was a bargain." Then the cheer went out of him, all at once, the way it did in a boy still learning to carry the true things, and he looked at the cold courtyard stones as if the memory were written there. "I knew, you know, near the end of it. I was too weak to say so, and half the time I couldn't tell dream from waking, but I knew she was standing over the cup, and I knew you were sleeping in the chair so I wouldn't be alone, and I thought, if I die, Penny will burn the whole house down looking for who did it, and she'll be right, and nobody will ever believe her." He swallowed. "And then I didn't die, and you didn't burn the house down. You walked 4 days and made a king believe you instead. That's better. That's harder." He looked up, and his father's eyes were bright. "I just wanted you to know I never once thought the quiet was weakness. Not for a single hour of it. I was watching the whole time." Penny put her arm around his thin shoulders, and did not trust herself to speak, and they stood a while in the dark, and let the stars do the talking, which the Hartwells had always been good at, saying the largest things by saying nothing at all. Spring came to Velmont the way spring came to stone cities, slowly and then all at once, with crocuses forcing themselves up through the gaps between courtyard flagstones, and the smell of the air changing almost overnight from iron cold to something green and wet and possible. And it was in the Eastern Library, on an ordinary morning near the end of that spring, that Penny first heard her wolf clearly. She had been reading one of the law ledgers, because some habits were permanent, and it came the way real change so often comes, without any drama at all. Not with the force of transformation, not with the rush of power she had spent her whole life being told she would never feel, just a quiet presence that had previously been a voice through a wall becoming, without announcement, a voice in the same room. Warm, certain, ancient in the way that all wolves were ancient, carrying something older than the individual life it inhabited. She sat very still for a moment, then she set the book down and went to find Xander. He was in the war room with 2 of his generals, standing over a map of the Northern Territories, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who read her face before she spoke a word. He said something quiet to his generals. They left. "She woke up," Penny said. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell the leather and wood smoke and cold morning air. That was simply what he smelled like, and he looked at her face with that complete attention she had stopped trying to deflect weeks ago. "I know," he said. "I felt it." She looked at him. The mate bond had been a quiet thing between them all. This while, present, acknowledged, neither denied nor rushed, growing the way plants grow when they have water and time, rather than being forced. She had chosen it in increments, the way she chose everything, deliberately, on her own terms, trusting her own reading of what was real. "I'm choosing this," she said, because she needed him to know it, needed it on record, clear and unambiguous. Not because of the bond. Because of you. Because of who you are when no one needs anything from you. Because of the riders you sent before the verdict. Because of the boy in Ashenford. Because you told me the truth without strategy behind it, on a morning when strategy would have served you better. She took a breath. Because you came around a corner with a blade in your hand, and no cloak. And the first thing you said was not that I was safe, it was to ask if I was hurt. I have spent my whole life around people who checked the estate before they checked the child. You checked the child." She had not meant to say so much. She had rehearsed none of it, and that, she realized, was the whole of what had changed in her. That here was the one room in the world where she had stopped arranging her words in order of legal weight before she spoke them. "For 23 years, she said, quieter, "the truest thing anyone could say about me was what I wasn't. Not quite an omega, not quite a wolf, not quite worth the trouble of a name. And you walked into a hall full of people who could have gone on believing all of that forever, and you looked at me like I was a question worth the whole of your attention, and you have not once looked away since. Do you know what that does to a person who was raised to be furniture? It is a dangerous thing you have done to me, Xander. I don't think you know how dangerous." His hand came up and rested against her jaw, gentle and unhurried. "I know," he said again, softer. She leaned into it, briefly, and that was the whole of it. The choice made not in a grand moment but in a quiet room in a stone city in early spring, two people who had both spent long years carrying weight they had not asked for, setting some of it down at the same time. They were married in the great hall of Velmont at the first full moon of summer, under the wolf and moon banners and the candlelight of 100 torches, and the gaze of a kingdom that had spent 3 months deciding what to make of an omega from the lowlands, with a dormant wolf and a Hartwell signet ring, and had, in the end, decided in her favor, in part because the story of the waitress who stood slowly in a burning tavern had reached the capital, and grown in the reaching, and in part because a kingdom, like a person, will follow a king's eyes to learn what to value, and everyone in Velmont had seen where the king's eyes went. Eli stood at her side. He had grown an inch since arriving in the city, and had somehow, in the intervening months, charmed 3 of the king's senior lawkeepers into teaching him the inner workings of the tribunal system, which Penny found both entirely predictable and deeply reassuring. Fen was there too, in the second row, scrubbed and stiff in a borrowed coat, his father beside him with the debt reviewed and restructured, and the fear gone out of his face, both of them brought north by the king's writ at Penny's asking, and when Penny caught the boy's eye across the crowded hall he grinned at her with his whole soul, the way he had grinned in a wrecked tavern, and mouthed, "You said you were passing through." When Xander took her hand at the altar, Penny's wolf rose fully for the first time. Not a surge, not a flood. Just a steady, warm rise, like a fire finally catching on wood that had been waiting a long time to burn. She felt the bond complete between them, solid and chosen and real. And she looked at the man across from her, who had stood in a corridor outside a petition hall, and sent riders for her brother before the verdict was in, and she thought about her father saying, "Let them think quiet means weak, let them keep thinking so." She had let them, and she had ended up here. Lord Cedric's trial concluded that autumn. He was stripped of his holdings. All 7 acquired estates were returned to their original heirs or their families. The Land Merchant Consortium was dissolved by Crown order, and the bond codes were revised as a direct consequence of the Cedric case, so that no child in a border village could again be carried off for the price of a father's debt by men with a document and no seal. Fen's father was among the first names entered under the new codes, restructured and freed, which Penny insisted was a coincidence of timing, and Xander insisted was nothing of the kind, and which was, in the way of most true things, both. Lady Voss served her sentence. She did not write to Penny. Penny did not write to her. Some things do not require a closing letter. The Hartwell estate was restored and thriving by the time Eli reached his majority, the lands managed carefully through the intervening years by the Crown administrator Penny had chosen, an elderly woman from the Northern Territories named Sarah, who had the rare quality of being genuinely difficult to deceive and entirely indifferent to flattery. When Eli formally took his title, he invited Penny home for the ceremony, and she went, riding now rather than walking, with an escort and a different kind of weight on her shoulders, not burden but standing. She stood in her father's library again, among the ledgers she had read by firelight as a girl, and felt his absence as a warmth rather than a wound. He had been right about the law. He had been right about quiet. He had been right, she thought, about most things that mattered, and wrong only about how long it would take the world to catch up to what he already knew about his daughter. Xander found her there an hour later. He always found her in libraries eventually. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his gray-blue eyes moving across the shelves with the expression of a man cataloging what he would need to read, and she looked at him from across the room and felt the bond between them, steady and permanent, like a stone foundation under everything else. "Ready?" he said. She took one last look at the shelves, At her father's ring, now worn on her finger rather than a cord. At the window where she had stood on the morning she decided not to disappear. Yes, she said. She crossed the room and took his hand, and they went home. And if you have walked this far with them, 4 days on foot and 1 long night with an arrow drawn in the dark, then you already know the kind of story this was, the kind where the quiet one turns out to be the sharpest blade in the room. If it warmed you, stay with us. Follow the pack, ring the bell, and tell us in the comments who you were rooting for the moment the waitress set down her tray. Because there is always another petition to hear, another road north, another woman the whole world underestimated right up until the moment she stood slowly and everyone froze. We will see you at the next full moon.